Let's get joined up. Today's show is brought to you by Audible, and right now you can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/joined up. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. So thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a regular show about all things writing, including interviews with authors, screenwriters, and key figures from the publishing industry. Plus loads of hints, tips, and inspiration for all creatives. You can follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast, leave a quick iTunes review, or just tell a friend.
Joined Up Writing.
Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly and it's episode 137 with me. Yeah, this week's guest interview has had to rearrange due to illness, but it's been a few weeks since my last interview and I thought I'd put out a short solo episode. Wait, come back, don't leave. It'll be over quickly, I promise. But I realised that in the whole time I've been doing this show, I don't think I've ever talked in detail about my entire writing journey, how I got into words, what I started out wanting to achieve, and where I've actually ended up, and the strange path that I took to get here. Now, obviously, that's all stuff I ask other people about in the interviews, and I'm sure regular listeners might have picked up the odd nugget here and there. But for me, this show has always been about other people. The real writers, the ones with a published book and an optioned screenplay or a few TV credits to the name maybe. And that's not false modesty, by the way. That's me being honest about the way I view my writing career to date. Despite the logical part of my brain reminding me that part of my actual job, the one that pays my mortgage, is based on writing scripts. Admittedly, they're almost always commercial or promotional films, but they still require all of the same skills I've been honing since I started writing stories at the age of 7. Yes, I've also written and produced a successful short film, Inkling, as well as monologues, a YouTube drama, and a couple of published short stories. But until I get something on telly or I publish a novel, I don't think I'll ever see myself as a worthy Joined Up Writing podcast guest. Despite that, this isn't going to be a kind of woe is me, boo-hoo fest, I promised. I know there are loads of you out there who must be on a similar journey to me, and it's with that in mind that I thought some of you, at least, might be interested to hear my story. And hopefully you'll be inspired to share your own stories with me, or at the very least realise that we've all been through similar experiences in this strange and difficult land called writing. I'll tell you how and why a working class bloke fell in love with writing, how I was flushed with the arrogance of youth before being brought back down to earth by a narrow-minded careers advisor. We'll cover the university debacle, the fun music years, the practice novels, and how I escaped a job I hated to finally put some of my writing skills to good use, as well as bringing you up to date with where I am now and where I'm going. I'll be honest, I am nervous, but I'm laying myself bare in the hope that you can relate and that you'll have a better understanding of why I write and why I started this podcast in the first place, to connect with other writers and creatives. And on that subject, before we get properly started, I also wanted to remind you that I love to hear from you, so get in touch by emailing me wayne@waynekellywrites.com, dropping me a line on Twitter @JUPodcast, or swinging by the Facebook page. That's what David Ellis did when he reached out to tell me about the groundbreaking poetry-based project he's currently working on with fellow author and photographer Sandrine Marouat. David and Sandrine have created a partnership called Auroras and Blossoms, which produces 3 different inspirational creative magazines. They're also in the midst of publishing an anthology called Po Art Mo, or Positive Art Month, which will include art, photography, poetry, and short stories, so I'll put a link to that in the show notes. One last thing is a reminder to drop by Apple Podcasts or whichever podcast app you use and to leave the show a 5-star rating and review, as it really does help other people to find the show. Right. Deep breath. Let's crack on with the story that no one asked to hear, and I'll try to skip the boring bits, but let's start at the beginning. So one of my first real memories is when I started to learn to read. It was the series of books that most British people of my generation will remember that included characters like Roger Red Hat and Jennifer Yellow Hat. I've got a recollection of reading one about a soldier, but what I was actually doing was just reciting it from memory. The words still looked like strange random symbols on the page, until one day they just weren't. It's probably just a trick of memory, but it really did seem like magic. One day it was all squiggly lines, and the next it was a code that I could not only decipher, but also write down myself. And to be honest, it blew my tiny mind. I could pick up any book and tell myself a story, and when I mastered writing, I could tell my own. Some kids loved the pictures, but for me, it was always about the words. I couldn't wait to get started, and for the next couple of years I jumped at any chance I could get to write a story. The first ones didn't venture much beyond describing my weekend or writing about a pet dog, a dog that didn't actually exist because we couldn't afford pets at home. Don't worry, I'm not going to lapse into an Oliver Twist tale of my impoverished childhood. I wasn't brought up in the workhouse and I never tried gruel, but I was the oldest of 3 boys, being raised by very young working class parents trying their best to make ends meet. I get my love of reading from my mum. She wasn't reading the classics or anything, but she was the first person I saw reading fiction, and on the odd occasion I'd find a book lying around, I'd pick it up and give it a go. I'm not sure James Herbert's The Rats was suitable for a 10-year-old, but I seem to have survived, and it hasn't come up too much in therapy. My dad read a lot too, but that was mainly non-fiction, and what I got from him was my enduring love of films. But what it all came down to was the stories. That's what I've always loved. Words taking me on a journey with unforgettable characters in places and situations totally out of my experience. That's why those initial forays into creative writing, only focusing on life at home or school, soon became boring to me. The next thing I know, I was writing about how an evil Barbie doll and a horde of doll soldiers were working on total world domination, beginning with an annexation of my small Leicestershire village. I was only 9, but I can remember being disappointed with my teacher's bemused reaction to the story. Instead of encouraging my imagination, he just looked at me like I was nuts. The strange thing was, even at such a young age, I knew that he was in the wrong, and fortunately, it only encouraged me to keep going. I think it was because I enjoyed the act of writing it so much in the first place, the thrill of coming up with something new and my youthful ignorance giving me license to do anything I wanted. It's a feeling I think many of us try and fail to recapture when we write as adults. The rules get in the way, the weight of expectation and the knowledge of all the other stories that have been told before. But where my primary school teacher had let me down, my high school teacher, my high school English teacher, Mr. Williams, more than made up for it. From my very first creative writing assignment, he encouraged me to go further. It was the first time I seemed to effortlessly get good grades in a subject, but even if he did give me an A, he'd always take the time to give me lots of critique that would improve my next piece. I still remember and use some of his advice. I wrote a horror story that I now realise was just a rip-off of Stephen King's story Maximum Overdrive about machines mysteriously taking on a life of their own. He loved it, but said, spend more time drawing your reader into this world that you're creating. Pay more attention to the senses, especially touch and smell, and that stayed with me to this day, especially when I'm editing a first draft. Mr. Williams was the first person outside my family that made me feel that I could actually write. So high school was good. I was growing in confidence and seriously thinking about how I could have a career in writing. My dad suggested journalism, but neither he or anyone in the family had the faintest idea about how you go about achieving that. He was a window cleaner and my mum worked in a factory. They wanted to help, but they left school at 16, and the world of higher education or white-collar work in general just seemed totally alien to them. But that was okay. I still had that arrogance of youth that I talked about and was looking forward to my meeting with the careers advisor. And I proudly told her I wanted to be a journalist. Her answer? Ooh, that's really hard to get into. Thanks for the support, love. I think that's where the doubt began to creep in. But I shrugged it off again for a while, and a couple of years later I managed to secure 2 days work experience at local paper, the Loughborough Echo, and that was the final nail in the coffin of my journalistic ambitions. I spent one of those days working through an activity pack that included a word search and an exercise to write 100 words about a cat getting stuck up a tree, and the other day, which admittedly was slightly better, was spent in court watching a series of small cases in the hope that one of them would be interesting enough for the reporter that I was with to write a story on. Spoiler alert, they weren't. To be fair, I can't lay all of the blame at the door of the Loughborough Echo. I was probably immature and easily bored, but it was enough to make me ditch the idea of becoming a reporter. It could also have been to do with the fact that I just found a love of music and performing. In a freak karaoke-based accident involving a performance of Michael Jackson's Billie Jean, complete with attempted dance moves, I'd discovered that I could hold a tune and entertain a room full of people. More importantly, I loved it. So I joined a band at school, becoming the lead singer of Candy Joint, which later became Shaft. Don't ask. And at the same time, I'd managed to use my communication studies A-level project as an excuse to put on a cabaret featuring comedy sketches written by me, live music with my band, and even some stand-up. That was me and a friend that did 5 minutes each. Yeah, I cringe now at the realisation of what a massive ego trip it actually was, but I mention it here for a couple of reasons. Firstly, to show you how writing has always fed into everything that I do, because it was my first foray into writing scripts and it was the start of my songwriting efforts. But secondly, in narrative terms, this is very much the rise before the inevitable fall. I was 17, confident to the point of arrogance and convinced I was on the cusp of greatness. 1 year later, I got my exam results. Listener, they were not good. And just to prove this whole exercise isn't just one long humble brag, I'll even tell you what I got. The best of the bunch was a C in communication studies, a subject I'm not even sure still exists, a D, yes that's a D, in English language, you know, the thing I supposedly wanted to pursue as a career, and, wait for it, an E in English literature because basically I didn't read any of the books. It's a terrible state of affairs, but I'd be lying if I said I was totally surprised on the day that I found out. After all, I hadn't even bothered to apply for university, telling everyone that I was taking a year out, and I spent all of my second year of A-levels writing songs or performing on stage. My year out was actually spent working full-time at Tesco's, pushing trolleys around the car park, doing youth theatre and attending a weekly pub quiz with the only two friends that hadn't gone off to university, both of which were taking a genuine year out, having deferred their place at uni. And that first year out was fun. No more academic pressure, no more lying to my parents and teachers, no high expectations, just earning a bit of cash and spending it on having a good time. But once that year was up, I really was on my own, and the realities of working full-time in retail finally hit home. My first band was a distant memory by this stage, half the members having moved away or gone to university, and even the theatre stuff was coming to an end. With each passing day, I became more miserable and believing that I'd actually ruined my life. I mean, I was 19 after all. Despite their initial disappointment and anger at the lack of effort during A-levels, it was actually my parents that suggested I consider going to university after all. It'd have to be local because I was supporting myself and I had no real desire to leave home anyway, and Dad suggested it should be doing a course that I was guaranteed to get a job at the end of. I mean, this is, good practical advice, but it also comes from a traditional working class idea of vocational education. You get trained up in something and you get a job. Unfortunately, it led me to choose entirely the wrong course, and this is where present version of Wayne shouts back through time to young Wayne to try to warn him he's about to make a mistake. Do an English degree, young Wayne. You love writing. You're good at it. If only. Instead, young Wayne thumbed through the prospectus and chose multimedia computing. I mean, what even is that? There should have been alarm bells when I went for the interview and told the head of the course that I hated maths and I was terrible at it. Will there be a lot of programming? He expertly dodged the question because they were quite clearly desperate for some saps to fill their course quota, and I was just happy to be going back into education. Another spoiler alert, by the way, there was a lot of programming. Now, with hindsight, it was clear that my heart wasn't in it anyway. I got a very small means-tested grant of just a few £100s, and what did I spend it on? A guitar. Because by this time, I'd managed to find another band and a future best friend, George Odom, who coincidentally produces all the music for this podcast. And George encouraged me to learn to play the guitar so that I could move from just writing lyrics to trying to compose full songs. I wasn't writing short stories or anything at the time, so 3-minute pop songs seemed really appealing. They were, and still are, a great way to practice condensing an idea or a story down to the bare essentials. It's like poetry, but without as much of the skill and discipline of sticking to things like metre. I like to think of it as poetry for lazy people, so it's basically perfect for me. I'll save you the specific details of how I became more interested in the band and ended up touring the UK in a transit van, and just say that I ditched university before the end of the first year and I had to pay back my grant in instalments. Are you sensing what a rounded, level-headed young man I was? No, Me neither. And I'm starting to wonder why I'm telling you all this, but I think it's important to be honest about the whole journey and to point out that most of us have had these strange and bumpy rides along the way. So the band chugged along, but there were the inevitable musical differences awaiting around the corner. Half the band just wanted to play covers for cash and aim for the heights of playing on a cruise ship or maybe a 6-week residency at a holiday camp, and the rest of us wanted to focus on writing and recording our own stuff and playing it for free to a bunch of disinterested punters on a wet Tuesday evening in Worksop. I suppose when you put it like that. Anyway, safe to say, I never did find musical stardom, but I've never stopped writing and recording songs in various bands, but always with George at my side. I haven't been in a band for a few years now, but George and I still collaborate and play the odd gig when the opportunity and desire arises. Anyway, I digress. All of this meant that eventually I was back in a full-time job at Tesco, this time as a trainee checkout manager. I was 21, still living at home and spending most of my evenings listening to music and drinking bottles of cheap red wine. I was low, and it's at times like these that I tend to fall back on writing, so I started what would become my first attempt at a novel. I was reading a lot of Nick Hornby at the time, with a little bit of Mike Gale thrown in for good measure, so I was channeling that useless man struggles with life and emotions kind of vibe, which was pretty easy to do because I was that man. The book was called To Be Honest and was about a feckless but amiable loser who finds himself trapped in a retail job he hates as he tries to find love while dealing with a series of ridiculous mishaps. I know. Where do I get my ideas? But it was such fun to write. I'd just started what was to be a brief relationship at the time, and I was sharing pages with the girl that I was seeing, which meant I had an audience, and I'm always better with an audience. Someone waiting to find out what happens next can be a really powerful incentive to write. Actually, the book lasted longer than the relationship, but I did finish a very messy first draft. At this point, I'm not sure I even knew about editing or redrafting, but I did know it wasn't good enough to be published, so I printed it out and put it in an actual drawer where it still resides. I've taken a peek at it at certain times, and let's just say I don't see it venturing out into the world while I'm still alive. Let's start speeding things up a bit and skip through the rest of my 20s, something I wish I could have done in real life. The single best thing that happened is finding my wife, Alison, and the birth of our daughter when I was 24. A précis of the rest, I was at Tesco for a total of 6 years before going to work for a bank for another 6 years, by the end of which I was just about as depressed as I've ever been. And it was after being at the bank for about 5 years when things were particularly bad for me. My uncle died suddenly, which was terrible, obviously. I hated my job and I felt awful most of the time. There were many mornings when I fantasised about driving straight past the bank and just to keep going until I reached Scotland or, well, Narnia, it didn't matter. Anywhere but standing in that banking hall, willing the hands of the clock to pick up speed so that the end of the day would come quicker. Literally wishing away my time. Now, don't get me wrong, it wasn't like working in a coal mine. My colleagues were really nice people, but it just wasn't for me at all. And I realised I had to make some big changes. So one of the things I did was to start writing again. Initially, just short stories. Not for competitions or anything like that, just purely for fun. I'd have an idea and I'd just start writing. Occasionally I'd even do flash fiction while I was supposed to be working, so I'd lock myself in an office where I was supposed to be making sales calls and bash out a story on the work computer, and because I wasn't able to save anything on the secure network, I'd have to print it out and then delete everything off the screen. It didn't matter, it just felt great to do it. So if any of my bank colleagues ever get to hear this, hopefully it goes some way to explaining why I had such terrible sales figures. It's also around this time that I discovered Stephen King's memoir, On Writing. It's a book that gets mentioned almost every month on the show, but it really did fire me up. Not just with my writing, but in the sense I knew it was essential to work towards having a career that reflected my need to be creative. Selling credit cards and personal loans just wasn't cutting it. So I began digging what I came to think of as my escape tunnel. I didn't really know where the tunnel would lead, but I started digging anyway, in the hope that any life on the other side of the fence would be more fulfilling than the one I was living. I bought a cheap video camera and some editing software, and after making a few fun home videos, decided I would try my hand at music videos. I got a website and some business cards and asked a young local band if they wanted me to make them a promo for their latest song. Again, it was initially just for fun and in my spare time, but the very act of doing something positive, something creative, made me feel better. I had something else to focus on. And when you're in a more positive frame of mind, other positive things tend to happen, even if some of them seem fortuitous. Now, without wanting to get all hippy-dippy about it, I think if you're more open to the possibilities, good things can happen. And a couple of years before, I'd been in yet another band, this one was called Charlie, and a school friend of mine, Rich, who had since gone on to a career in video production, agreed to make a music video for us. And he brought along his flatmate and colleague, Matt, to help us out. And meeting Matt really did change my life. By the time I'd started making some of these positive life changes a couple of years later, Matt was going through his own trauma, losing his dad to cancer. He'd also been dissatisfied with his career, working for a large production company too, for some time, and with the passing of his dad, he knew he needed to strike out on his own. So he started his own video production company. It was a big risk to go it alone with just a small camera, a basic edit suite and a tiny office, but he made it work. And by the time we reconnected, Matt had been working for himself for around a year and hoped eventually to be able to find someone he could employ to help him grow the company and take on bigger projects. I told him about my crude attempts to make music videos, but not with any real belief that he'd be able to offer me a job. I didn't have any experience or relevant qualifications for one thing. Despite this, Matt took a chance on me and offered me the opportunity to work on a casual basis, just one day a week, initially just manning the phones and trying to learn the ropes of editing and production. The bank were in the process of insisting that I start working on Saturdays, something that ordinarily I would have just resisted for as long as possible, but to their surprise I agreed on the basis that I could now take Mondays off. So this became the day that I could work for Matt. I worked hard. Matt helped me to set up an edit suite at home where I could do offline edits in the evenings and weekends. And I did this for almost a year until one day in 2006, Matt called me up with the news that he'd secured a big educational contract and it'd allow him to offer me a full-time job. I just couldn't believe it. It was like magic. The change of outlook seemed to have worked. I realise I was also incredibly lucky to have met Matt when I did, and that Matt took a big leap of faith when he put his trust in me in the first place. And for that, I'll always be eternally grateful. After the fact, it sounds dramatic to say saved my life, but looking back on how depressed I was and how negative I felt about my life, I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration. So Matt, if you stumble across this recording at some point in the future, thanks buddy, it meant a lot. I'm glad to say 14 years later we're still working together, making each other laugh and making lots of films we can be proud of. Anyway, back to the writing. So now I was working in a creative arena, using the bits of my brain that had been wasting away in my previous jobs, and eventually I knew I'd get back to writing. Two things happened. I heard about a crazy event called NaNoWriMo, and I discovered a local writing critique group. So NaNoWriMo, or National Novel Writing Month, was something I'd stumbled across online several years ago, and it seemed like a brilliant and nuts thing to attempt, to write 50,000 words of a novel during the month of November. I already had the beginnings of a novel idea. I'd actually written around 20,000 words of it before while still at the bank and then ditched it, and I thought I could use Nano as an excuse to start the whole thing from scratch, whilst hopefully joining up with some kind of local writing community. I made a rough chapter outline, and when November began, I went hell for leather on my novel Let Sleeping Gods Lie, a comedic urban fantasy about Eddie Volta, a pastry-addicted collector of souls working in the afterlife, which is actually a huge faceless corporation called Central. It's got echoes of Douglas Adams about it. I wrote more than 60,000 words by the end of the month and had an absolute blast writing it. Unfortunately, it would take me perhaps another 18 months to write the end on the messy first draft of about 80,000 words, which still hasn't been edited, by the way, but that's another story. And there are parts of the book I love, but the final third needs a huge amount of work. Despite that, and I could be remembering it with rose-tinted spectacles, but as I think about it now, I'm actually wondering why I never even attempted to redraft it. I probably should get back to it. Maybe one reason is because when I wrote it, I was still a bit of a novice writer, and that was about to change as just after that I joined the Phoenix Writers, a lovely critique group based in Leicester. I found out about it from my now long-standing writing buddy, Maria Smith, who'd mentioned it in her blog. I can still remember my first tryout/audition for the group. I took part of a short story and they very politely took it apart, citing overwriting and redundant words amongst other things, but also giving me some really positive feedback on the story. And I learned more in that first session than probably the previous 5 years of writing. Fortunately, they let me into the group, and although I'm no longer currently a member, they helped me so much with my craft and I made some great friends too. I began to write lots of short stories, encouraged by their support, and eventually being published in the anthology that the group produced. I also had a couple of other short stories published in other anthologies, including my Ealing comedy-inspired tale When Your Number's Up, about a deranged bingo calling machine that attempts to kill a kind old lady. So that was the first reason I stalled on Let's Sleep in God's Lie, but I think the other reason was that, as usual, I just wanted to get onto something new. This is one of my recurring problems, unfortunately. I had a false start with a novel about a Russian psychic called Surly Geiger, which I still hope to revisit, but eventually settled on writing a crime novel that grew out of a short story. That was to become Safe Hands, about Mickey Blake, a 58-year-old safecracker able to open any vault with only his heightened sense of touch. I've mentioned it many times on the show, and anyone who's listened recently will know I've redrafted the novel a few times and submitted to perhaps, a dozen agents or small publishers without success. They'll also know that I've currently decided to hit pause with my submissions and take a break from it before I decide what to do. Which almost brings us up to date, if anyone out there is still listening, but I should give you a bit of an idea about how the other side of my writing has developed over the years, and that's script writing. If writing novels has taught me anything, it's that I love to write dialogue, and I think it's actually one of my strengths. That, and the fact that it's become a big part of my career, is probably why I've leaned more towards screenwriting of late. As mentioned at the top of the show, my day job mostly requires commercial-type scripts for promotional films or occasionally something a bit more emotive for charity organisations or campaigns. But a number of years ago I started writing monologues, one of which, I'm Not Going to Think About Edie, was first performed on stage and is now available as a short film on YouTube. I also wrote a short horror suspense film called Inkling, again mentioned earlier, which I directed and was shortlisted at this year's Horror Hound Festival in Cincinnati. And as UK lockdown began this year, I wrote and subsequently produced a short drama piece called Life Support, about two women who were brought together by a seemingly random Skype call. And I've also written another short film that was due to go into production before all this pandemic craziness happened, which is another horror film called Dead Romantic. So yes, I'm yet to find an agent or get one of my novels published, but I still work on my craft. I try to learn from the many amazing guests I'm privileged to speak to for the podcast, and I continue to write scripts with either a view to make more films myself or to have something commissioned for TV. Despite the regular bumps in the road and the occasional periods of inactivity, I'm a writer. And if you're out there similarly doubting yourself because you're yet to trouble the bestseller lists, win a competition, or have your script picked up, then just ask yourself one question. Do you write? Because if you do, then you're a writer. So keep going and stay positive, because if my haphazard writing and life journey shows anything, it's that good things happen when you're ready to let them happen. Right, I feel like I should play some church music or something there to punctuate the end of my sermon, but I won't. I really hope I haven't bored you to tears and that you found something interesting or inspiring about my experiences, but either way, let me know by emailing me at wayne@waynekellywrites.com, tweeting the show at JUPodcast, or leaving me a comment on the Facebook page. Also, don't forget to join the free mailing list at joinedupwriting.co.uk to get a couple of my short stories and be the first to find out when a new show drops or about upcoming events. I don't think I've ever talked uninterrupted for quite so long, and it's not something I plan to repeat too often. The next show will feature writer Louise Walters, who also has her own small indie publishing company. She recently shared a really honest view of the difficulties and challenges faced by small independents on Twitter, so I think that'll be a really interesting chat. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.